In the early days, if your spouse is on the list and you've created some damage by craziness, one of the amends you're going to make is to start telling the truth. And telling the truth would mean going back over history in what we've often referred to on this show as, full disclosure. You're going to sit down from start to finish and talk about the truth. You're going to fill in the holes. You're going to admit specifically times when you lied. And you're going to tell the reality of your history in terms of what you actually did. I sit in quite often on these kind of sessions where, in our case, a husband is finally getting honest with a spouse. It's hard to describe the sense of relief on the face of the spouses when they finally hear the truth.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Evert, your co-host. Happy to be with you here today as we continue our legacy rebroadcast of the series, The 7 Principles of Recovery. Today we're going to be talking about principle number 5, which is accepting responsibility and making amends. These podcasts feature our founder, Dr. Mark Laaser, and I know you're going to enjoy his presentation today. Here now is Dr. Mark Laaser and the Faithful and True podcast, The 7 Principles of Recovery, recovery number 5. Today we're going to address principle number 5, and principle number 5 is described as we explore the damage we have done, accept responsibility, and make amends for our wrongs.
Yeah, and I've been feeling compelled, I guess, all the way along this series to obviously recognize and accept that the principles are built on the foundation that many of us learned in our early recovery from the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. So the astute listener will know that we're basically talking about step 8 and 9, which is to, first of all, begin with the recognition that in our addiction and in our dysfunctional behaviors, we've hurt a whole lot of people. So we've betrayed trust, we've violated things, we've perhaps caused, all kinds of different damage. This is really, I think, one of the more challenging steps. And these principles are in order for a reason, by the way. So when you think about the fact that we're now built on the foundation of accepting our own powerlessness, learning how to more completely trust and surrender control of our life to God, that we've taken a complete inventory of all of our moral failures. We've built an accountability program. We've tried to look at some of the defects of our character and work on positive character development. Now, after we've got that foundation going, now we're going to look at kind of the serious work of thinking about all the people that we've harmed and then beginning to consider how we might make amends to all of them.
Well, it makes sense to me after, in light of last week's show in which we discussed Principle 4 and talked about the subject of accountability, it does feel like the next natural step would be accepting responsibility. Yeah, that's right. And last week we talked about, and we went over all of this kind of fast, I was thinking after the show, but the whole idea of going from pride and selfishness to humility, I think, is really based on understanding and accepting that we've made mistakes and that we've hurt people. So sitting down in this principle to kind of, very much take that seriously and even make lists of people that we've harmed will impress on us the fact that we've done some awful and terrible things and caused some damage. So where do you take it from there?
Well, remember now that we don't want to increase people's shame also, that we have to remember in the earlier principle 3 that, we're going to confess all of our sins to a person of spiritual authority. So I think it's always good as we get into this step to remember that we are forgiven for all of our sins and all of that, and to remember that God still loves us, God still cares for us. So start there. When you also build upon the foundation of, God's love and forgiveness, then I think that gives you some greater freedom to move into this particular principle. So I think the place to begin, Randy, is just to sit down with a piece of paper and ask yourself the question, who did I most harm by, my addiction or by my sinful behavior? And I think the average person out there will, if they're married, will recognize that, the number one person that they've harmed is their spouse. And so, his or her name will be kind of top on the list.
There's going to be a lot of family members at the top of that list.
That's right. I was going to get to the fact that, the children are on that list. In the early days for me, it was Debbie, Sarah, Jonathan, and Benjamin. And, that was the first four names. And that was those were the four that I were the most concerned about in the early days.
Well, I think that's going to be true of most individuals' lists when they sit and open their hearts to who has been harmed the most by your behavior. It's going to be that very intimate, personal family list.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's good in the early days of recovery to really focus on the more immediate people, that are in your life, the ones that you're living with for sure,
right?
And then maybe your extended family, also, friendships that you may have violated along the way. You might think about it just in terms of categories, like family, friends, work associates, people at church. Think in terms of categories, but make as much as you can a complete list of all the people that you feel like you've harmed.
Now, once that list has been created and you've reviewed it and you think that it's pretty comprehensive, where do you go from there?
I always consider this project it's like a trifold piece of paper. You're going to divide a piece of paper into 3 columns. The first column, the left column, will have, in fact, all of those names that we were just talking about. The middle column, and this is a hard one like it all is, but is to, next to that person's name, describe how you think you've actually harmed them. What is the nature of the wrong that you committed? What is the nature of the damage that you did? And then the third column, the column on the right, would be a description briefly of the amend that you're planning to make. So, in the show today, we're going to get into some of the different kinds of amends that are out there, because I think the word amends is often misunderstood, or at least not fully comprehended. So I want to talk about that today.
Well, and wouldn't the amends vary from individual to individual?
That's right.
The amends that are necessary for you to make with your spouse would be uniquely different from the ones that you would make with a coworker or your children.
Yeah, that's possibly true. And I think as we get into this and get into maybe a couple of examples, I think it might be easier for the listeners to understand. So let's talk about, let's say your spouse is number one on your list. Let's say that the damage you described is that, you've betrayed their trust, you've violated your vows, you've done whatever damage to that person's sense of self-esteem that you think you may have created. One of the ways that you've done that is one of the specific harms that you've committed is that you were a liar. You didn't tell the truth. You covered your tracks. You specifically denied certain things. And, one of the damages that creates in a lot of spouses is kind of a confusion. Some spouses around here, anyway, describe it as feeling kind of crazy. You're telling them one thing, they sense another thing. They don't have the objective data, so, it makes them feel crazy. So many of the wives around here describe feeling crazy, and they sometimes start acting crazy. And then one of the awful things that sometimes the addicts do is blame their spouse for being crazy, and that can get them into all kind of justifications and stuff. In the early days, if your spouse is on the list and you've created some damage by craziness, one of the amends you're going to make is to start telling the truth. And telling the truth would mean going back over history in what we've often referred to on this show as, full disclosure. You're going to sit down from start to finish and talk about the truth. You're going to fill in the holes. You're going to admit specifically times when you lied. And you're going to tell the reality of your history in terms of what you actually did. I sit in quite often on these kind of sessions where, in our case, a husband is finally getting honest with a spouse. It's hard to describe the sense of relief on the face of the spouses when they finally hear the truth. And that's one of the ways that we're making amends.
Well, and as the workbook points out so clearly, it reminds us that the reason for exploring the damage you have done is not to increase your despair or add to your shame.
That is right. It is basically to give you some better ideas about how you might actually make amends.
Because this principle is all about growing in maturity, isn't it?
That's right. All the principles are about growing in maturity and faith and spirituality and all of those kinds of things. To recognize the damage you've done, accept it, and to want to make amends for it, that's definitely growing in character.
And as you consider the many ways that you've harmed others, you gain a deeper understanding of how your sins have hurt the heart of God.
Yeah, that's true. That we've also offended God because God cares about all people and all that kind of thing.
Right.
So far we've talked about sitting down, making a list, having it be 3 columns. The names of the people you've harmed, the nature of the damage you've done, and then the nature of the amends that you're going to need to make. So I think it's kind of a universal amend, by the way, to consider the fact that you're going to start telling the truth. I'm guessing that most of the people on your list are people to whom you've told a lot of lies. So, one general large amend is to start telling the truth and to help people with their own sense of reality and all of that. So that's one thing. Sometimes when we think about damage, it's easy to think about obvious things, like if we've stolen something from somebody, like money, or robbed them out of a possession, then that damage is easier to correct. You can repay the debt. You can give them whatever you've stolen back. I think of, for whatever reason, whenever I come to this part of teaching about amends, I always think of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who Jesus invited to dinner, and Zacchaeus was so impressed with his new relationship with Jesus, he decided to make amends to all of those people that he'd robbed out of their money by charging them unfair taxes. And the Bible describes that he was so on fire with making amends that he actually repaid them back more than what he actually had taken from them in the first place. And I kind of like that, in that, that attitude of being willing to make amends is a willingness to give back.
Sure, generous amends. It seems that when you go to make amends, it's much more than the simple "I'm sorry."
That's right. Yeah, that's an often common misconception, I think, in the whole field of making amends, that it's simply going to the other person and saying you're sorry and asking for their forgiveness. For whatever reason, whenever I think of this one, I think about being a little kid, how oftentimes I would kind of beat up on my little brother. My parents would make me go apologize to him, and so I'd say, I'm sorry.
While you're slapping him on the side of the head.
I'm doing something else to him. But I said it so kind of sarcastically or insincerely or angrily that, and I think sometimes kids come to their parents, say, I'm sorry. It's in a way kind of manipulative. They want their parents not to punish them. So I think we need to be aware of the fact that sometimes we're shopping for what I call cheap grace. If we're just going and saying, I'm sorry, and then we quote 5 scriptures about forgiveness. By the way, that sounds crazy, but I've actually seen husbands do it. So not a good idea. So making amends is so much more than just saying you're sorry. It's again, paying back, becoming a truth teller. Now, I think in our field, one of the most important things to say is if the damage you've done is because of sexual infidelity, then one of the ways you're going to make amends is to become sexually pure, sexually faithful. The only way to kind of repay the damage that you've done to a spouse's trust, for example, is to, over time, become consistent in your behavior and to become sexually pure. And also not to expect them to just forgive you, right off the top, to realize that might take, months and sometimes even years for them to rebuild trust, all dependent on whether or not you've changed your behavior.
I would think that relationship with your spouse would be the most difficult of the trusts to regain.
That's right. Yeah. Well, obviously, it's a sacred level of trust. It's based on a commitment and a sacrament. So that's hard, but it can be done. I want the listeners to hear that it can be done. It does happen. It does take place, and it is really kind of pointing us to one of the major definitions of the word amend. If you look it up in the dictionary, or just look at its technical definition, amend means to change. Mm-hmm. So amend means to do something differently. So if you've been doing something sinfully, the main way to make an amend is to change sinful behavior into righteous behavior and to start doing the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. That's the major way we make amends.
What's the definition or the explanation for the difference between direct and indirect amends?
Oh, you're getting me to the other kind of major amends that we make. One of the things that happens in our field is that, some of the men want to go back to some of the women that they've acted out with and make amends to them, which is a stupid idea. I mean, if you're trying to change and end an affair, that kind of thing, then you want to not have contact with those women. So, it's not like they weren't at some level responsible for, the affair also. So you've got to let them do their own thing. And it's just very important as you're seeking to make amends to your spouse to not have contact with them. Some of the people in your life that you've harmed, may not want to have contact with you. They may not want to ever talk to you again. They may not ever want to see you again. You may come up with people on your list that you've harmed that are just no longer a part of your life. They live in another part of the world, the country, whatever. Or, worst case scenario, they've died and there's no way to pay them back or, ask for their forgiveness or that kind of thing. I've always thought that it was important to, make indirect amends. And indirect amends is to pick out certain behaviors or things or actions that you would take for other people that may represent the changes that you're trying to accomplish. I get into this better when I start thinking about examples of it. So one of the things I did in the early days when I wrote my first book was I decided to dedicate a percentage of the royalties from that book over the years, and they are donated to a counseling center that has a national outreach. And it works with women who have been betrayed sexually by pastors. And since part of my history was, as a pastor, I got into that kind of sexual betrayal with women, and as I look at, wanting to make amends to them, I'm not going to go back to them and have contact with them. That's not a good idea. That's not advisable. And, I'm sure none of them want to have any contact with me anyway. So, but now if I make indirect amends, I can donate money to a counseling center that works with women who have been sexually betrayed by other pastors. That is an indirect amend, if that makes any sense to the listeners. Another form of indirect amend is, I think, prevention. So to just summarize the other one, and I gave you kind of one of my own examples, but I think if you think about helping people today that might be victims of other people's damage, one way to make indirect amends is to give back to other people who have been damaged or hurt by something. I think is one way to make indirect amends. Another way to think of indirect amends is prevention. So if I can help other men get sober and get free of their sexual sinfulness, if I can prevent damage as it might occur in the future, I think that's an indirect amends. So
Sure.
Part of what I'm going to do, and certainly a lot of what we've dedicated our work here to at Faithful and True, is prevention. At whatever level we get men in terms of their own story, we're going to want to help them not perpetrate further damage into the future. It's been really gratifying to me over the last number of years to see an increasing number of younger men come in here, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old young men who are kind of, in some of their cases, wanting to take their sexuality and sexual purity seriously before they even get married. We've had a number of young men lately who are engaged to be married and have a date and want to kind of get a hold of their pornography addiction, their struggles with masturbation before going into marriage. When I think about all the damage that I created in my marriage because of my sexual sinfulness, if in the future I can help a man not do that kind of damage before he gets married, that to me is a way of making amends, of stopping damage before it actually starts.
So as we wrap up today's show and this Principle 5, what's the parting thought that you'd like our audience to be left with?
I think one of the things here is that, like so many of the principles, making amends is an ongoing lifetime journey. It's not something where, one time you sit down, make a list, go to people and say you're sorry, ask for their forgiveness, and now you're done.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm done with that.
Yeah, right. So it's more about the ongoing rest of your life change, amend that you're making. You're becoming a truth teller, a man of integrity. And it's also about giving back, not necessarily always directly, but oftentimes indirectly.
Thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. This has been the ongoing series, The 7 Principles of Recovery. And today, Dr. Laaser was talking about principle number 5, accepting responsibility and making amends. We hope that this has been a powerful episode for you. And we invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many free and valuable resources, as well as information and online registration for our 3-day intensive workshops. Check that out at faithfulandtrue.com. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week is going to be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.